Hey, everybody, it's Matt Gurney. The Line podcast is what you would normally get on a Friday. We are recording one, but we're doing it live, a live event tonight in Calgary. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're looking forward to it. But because we're recording it late, you're going to get that episode in a couple of days. It'll be Jen and I in our usual sparkling conversation, talking about the week that was, landing in your inbox in just a couple of days. To tide you over, fans of The Line, the latest episode of On the Line, our new podcast with Jason Nickerson, uh, colleague of mine, a friend, someone I had a chance to interview a bunch of times over the years. He's with Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, Canada. He's been all over the world in recent years at various humanitarian crises, natural disasters, infectious disease outbreaks, conflicts, and wars. We talk a lot about that in the state of the world and why we're having a hard time keeping up with the humanitarian demand. We talk about how he got into this kind of work, and he explains the kind of work that he does and that his colleagues do, how MSF goes into an area that is in the middle of an active war zone or has been destroyed by an earthquake, how they set up and how they do the work. We also talk about the role Canada has played, but also the things Canada has stopped doing that has been helping on the humanitarian front. You can check out their websites, of course, doctorswithoutborders.com or msf.com if you want to find a way to support their work. And I obviously encourage you all to do that. For now, though, enjoy Jason Nickerson's appearance in our latest podcast, On the Line. Jason, great to have you here. And I was joking with you just before we came on that you and I will have a wonderful, upbeat, uplifting conversation about some terrible things. But I want to, before we get into the meat of what we want to talk about today, don't worry, I'm not gonna get you on Oprah's couch here, but I'm just kind of curious about you. You and I have had the chance over the last couple of years to talk about, well, we started talking for real during the pandemic when there was
Yep.
a real need in Canada for emergency medical domestic response capacity, which is not normally the work you guys do. Normally, you're looking more.
That's right.
And then since then, you have brought a bunch of issues to my attention when there's been some crisis somewhere in the world that you thought needed some attention here. So I want to get to those crises. But first, how did you get into this? How does one end up being in this job with Doctors Without Borders? Like, what career path brought you there?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. So first of all, thanks for having me. And looking forward to the conversation. Um, yeah, how does one get here? To an extent, it's about living in the world long enough and doing enough interesting and relevant things. I started my professional career. I trained clinically. I'm a respiratory therapist, and so I started off working in adult intensive care, and then did a specialty in anesthesia, and then knew that I wanted to do something slightly different, so went down the grad school path and ended up doing a PhD in population health, and so along the way. There's always been an element of public service, I guess, that was instilled in me through my family. Basically, everybody in my immediate family is either a teacher or a hospital pharmacist or doing something productive and giving something back. So yeah, I mean, I think like most people that find their way into humanitarian work, driven by that sort of humanitarian spirit, if you will, but ultimately, uh, I think landing in a job where my role is to do advocacy and diplomacy, um, it's it's really about a reality that I'm personally offended, to be frank, that people lack access to something as basic as healthcare, whether in Canada or certainly in a humanitarian crisis. So yeah, that's it's been what a long, strange journey it's been, I guess. But yeah, that's how I
It
ended
has
up here.
seemed longer and stranger these last few years. I want to ask you a question actually about that. So how long have you been doing the work? How long have you been involved with Doctors Without Borders?
I've been with MSF, so we go by our French acronym
French
for
name, I know. I'd
Médecins
mangle
Sans
the
Frontières.
pronunciation, so I'm
That's
going the
okay.
anglais, buddy.
That's okay. I've been working for MSF for 8 years now, and before that, I sort of worked in the field for other organizations while hanging on to some academic and some clinical roles. So I'm still appointed as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Ottawa, and I'm an investigator at the Briere Research Institute, which is a continuing care hospital here. So try and keep visibility on a lot of different things and keep my head in the game.
I think what you're really telling me is you don't have time for hobbies. Like that was my interpretation.
I do. I'm a pretty active runner, and so that's how I keep myself grounded.
Yeah, but you're just sprinting from one job to the other. Like you're not doing it for fun. So in the 8 years you've been with MSF, don't worry, I can nail the pronunciation of 3 letters. I'm confident
Sure.
on that.
Sure.
In your 8 years there, what has been your snapshot view of sort of the state of the world? Because my last interview on the line was just a few days ago, and it was with the commander of the Canadian Armed Forces. And one of the points he was hammering, and obviously he has his own worldview on that, but he was talking about over the course of his own career, sort of an obvious and increasingly alarming deterioration in the state of the world, for lack of a better term. And we can get into more details, but I won't belabor the point. The world, from his vantage point and in his line of work, has just been getting more dangerous. What have the demands on MSF been, or even just in your time there?
Yeah. So first of all, I listened to the interview, and I thought it was quite interesting, and there's a few common threads there, that I think we're seeing. One of them being climate change, which I know you talked about on Monday. So one of the things that I'm not sure people fully realize is how much of an increase there has been in the number of people who are in need of humanitarian assistance around the world. We were looking at this internally, just asking the question a few days ago. And if you go back 5 years to every year, there's a global humanitarian overview that's published by the UN that tries to give a snapshot of what the needs are, what the funding requirements are, and so on. It's not a perfect exercise, but it is a data-driven one. And inside of 5 years, the world has gone from somewhere around 130 million people being in need of life-saving humanitarian assistance to more than 300. I mean, it's more than doubled in 5 years, and that is putting tremendous strain on humanitarian organizations to be able to respond. But it's also obviously indicative of something, a global phenomenon that's happening. I mean, there are multiple ongoing severe crises on the planet right now, whether we're talking about Sudan or Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo or, many other places. These are crises affecting millions and millions of people. And it's, I don't know if it's fair to characterize it as a shift, but it's obviously a worrying trend. And the world's not responding in a way that's commensurate to the needs. And there's a funding problem there. I mean, it is a dollars and cents kind of problem, but it's also a capacity problem as well. And those two things, are in some ways inextricably linked. But the humanitarian system is struggling to respond to the scope and the scale of the needs. And I'm really not sure that people are fully aware of just how many people are living precariously and in incredibly volatile, humanitarian crises.
When you talk about humanitarian crises, you talk about the last 5 years where the need is doubled. Are we talking, and I imagine the answer is some of all of the above, but I want to confirm this with you. Are we talking military conflicts? Are we talking natural disasters? Are we talking droughts and famines? Are we talking traditional, I mean, I know it sounds terrible to say this, but like traditional public health threats like infectious disease and access to clean water? When we look at this big swing, the doubling of the need, has that been driven by any one of these factors in particular? Like, can we go, aha, it's the war, or it's the drought, or like what is driving up that demand?
It's all of these things. And many of the kind of contemporary crises today are crisis multipliers, right? They're making an underlying situation worse than it already was. So if you take something like climate change, I mean, climate change affecting people in different parts of the world, like drought in Eastern Africa, for example. I mean, many people, whether you're talking about people in Somalia or in parts of Ethiopia, for example, are already living within existing humanitarian crises. And so now you layer on a prolonged period of drought that's leading to food insecurity, that's driving malnutrition. But then we're also simultaneously now seeing large measles outbreaks because we're coming out of a global pandemic where vaccination coverage fell I mean, there are millions of children that missed things like measles vaccines or diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccines. And we're now seeing the consequences of that. So, we can talk about that separately, but there is frankly just a lot going on, and in many cases the tools in the toolbox are running out. Like, just to give you one example, we're seeing a large number of cholera outbreaks right now. So cholera is an infectious disease; it can spread quite quickly. The underlying problem is a lack of access to water and sanitation infrastructure. There are cholera vaccines that are pretty effective. One dose provides good short-term protection. 2 doses is the standard. So there is a global stockpile of cholera vaccines that's managed by the World Health Organization and a few other organizations. There are no doses left in the global cholera stockpile. They've all been used. And they've been used in a way that is a dose sparing regimen, meaning that there's only 1 dose being used and not the full 2 doses, because that's the emergency intervention that allows more cholera doses to reach more people. But they're simply not enough. So that's a very particular kind of example. But there's frankly just a lot that is going on right now.
You and I are around the same age, and I remember being in university when there was the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean.
Yep.
And it was this sense that we, like, just the incredible outpouring, especially in Canada, but also all around the world. People were struck by that. There was a huge donation drive to get relief supplies and medical supplies, rebuilding, humanitarian evacuation, expatriate evacuation, just a real coordinated global effort. And I remember at the time how novel that seemed, not just the humanitarian response, but also a catastrophe of that scale.
Yeah.
And now, if I were to refer to the war, you wouldn't know if I meant Ukraine, Gaza, a series of African conflicts. Like, the amount of, and I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm being dismissive of this, and I'll trust in you to take this in good faith. There's always been a background level of humanitarian dysfunction. There's always been some part of the world that has had a government collapse or has some sectarian strife, or there's been a huge flood or something like that. What seems incredible to me is that it's popping up everywhere. We're going to talk Asia specifically in a few minutes, but right now we obviously got Middle East, with the prospect of a whole hell of a lot more Middle East being possible. We've got a series of conflicts in Africa. We've got one in the heart of Europe. And you talk about the humanitarian sort of resources being tapped out here. I get it. Like, there's only so many people like you who have to respond to this. I want to mention, Jason, before we started rolling, I had asked you what your visibility on the Gaza conflict was, because I know that there is a high degree of public interest in that. And you said you've been doing some of the public facing work of trying to get relief workers and supplies in, but that you're not an expert on the politics of that. And that's good news, because otherwise we'd have to talk about it and we'd ruin all of our days. But I'm curious, without getting into the specifics of Gaza or Ukraine or anything, can you tell me what your day is like when the phone rings and it's like, oops, October 7th just happened, or the phone rings and Russia's invaded Ukraine? How does that unfold from your perspective and that of your colleagues here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Somebody asked me the other day how many months in the year I dedicate to responding to unusual or sudden onset crises, and I think the answer is 13 months in a year. But So there's a few things. One is that we're we're a very large medical and humanitarian organization. Like we did over 16 million outpatient consultations in 2022. We work in 70-ish countries around the world. More than half of those are countries that are affected by either armed conflicts or some form of internal instability. Um, and you know, we have established and operate ourselves in as an independent humanitarian organization, and that allows us to go to where the needs are. And our independence takes a couple of different forms. One is that you know, we're a needs-driven organization, so we do our best to assess needs, assess the, you know, local capabilities to respond to them, and then if there are needs there that need to be responded to, we can deliver a very high quality medical intervention. But we're also largely financially independent. And so you mentioned the donations that came in after the tsunami. And I'll say that, you know, we have an operating budget of over 2 billion euros per year. 97% of that is from private funds, very generous individual donors. We have about 7 million donors around the world. And it's only 1% of our income that comes from public institutional funds like government donations. And in fact, the Canadian government is one of only 3 governments that we apply for funding from. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because it allows us, as I say, to react and respond quickly, and to be in places on the basis of need, and not because of some other factor. And so very often when a new crisis strikes, we typically have programs, you know, medical projects that are already there and some understanding of what's going on. That's not universally true by any stretch, but you know, we do have a large presence in places that can be volatile. Natural disasters can be a completely separate thing, but
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah,
A lot of the places that have particularly man-made disasters have been problematic for a while.
yeah, there's a certain risk, and
Yeah.
you know, it can be on our radar.
Yeah, so you have like a footprint there already, or at least you
Yeah,
have some institutional knowledge.
that's right.
Yeah.
And we also have a large international staff complement. So anyhow, the point is that we try and maintain a degree of visibility on what's happening in the world. So when there's a new crisis, I mean, my job is to be the humanitarian representative to Canada. So that's, you know, kind of fundamentally a humanitarian diplomacy role. We're an organization that's given ourselves 2 mandates. One is, and first and foremost, is to respond to humanitarian needs and provide high quality medical care. The second is what we call témoignage, or bearing witness, which gives us a mandate to speak out about what it is that we see. So when there is a sudden onset disaster, or you know, a new crisis, you know, assuming that we have visibility on what's happening, I mean, we're typically ingrained, or we have an ingrained process by which, you know, we're prepared to say what the needs are, right? Like what's going on, what are the gaps, what are we doing, and what, you know, what needs to happen. We're not in a coordinating role, but you know, if we see a gap, we're prepared to talk about it. So very often, you know, I I get a lot of phone calls about, okay, so what's going on, and we try and speak publicly about this because I think it's important for the Canadian public to know, you know, what it is that we're seeing, and what's happening or what's not happening or what should happen. But obviously, it's also important for decision makers, one, to be aware of what the needs are, but also to be confronted with a reality of what's happening on the ground.
I want to ask you a question that I'm not sure how much of this work you've done yourself. I know you do go out into the field, because
Yep.
you've sent me messages from really weird places. It's like, hi, I'm in. I look at the text, I'm like, oh my God. And I understand what I'm asking you is going to be a difficult question to answer, because I understand that every mission and every operation is differently here. But just for the viewers and the listeners who don't have a lot of visibility into the work that you do, tell me what you actually do on the ground. And I know that it will be always different, but let's say either you're in a conflict zone where the medical infrastructure has been destroyed or has been seized by enemy forces and they aren't sharing it, or you're going into a natural disaster area. We already mentioned the tsunami, or it could be like the Turkish earthquake a couple of years ago.
Yep.
What do you guys do on the ground? Like what is the kind of where the rubber meets the road for MSF and the world's vulnerable people?
So I'm going to speak generally about the organization and make it a bit less about me. But yeah, I mean we have a very ingrained emergency response capability. So we have emergency teams, for example, that are basically ready to jump if there is an emergency. So we have those are people like physicians, nurses, emergency coordinators, logisticians, administrators. Right. And so the initial step in any sudden onset kind of crisis is to like assess what the needs are, so that one, you're actually responding to needs that are clearly there, and trying to not be duplicative of something, right? Like fill a gap, go to neglected populations and provide high quality medical care. In a nutshell, that's what it is. Now we also work in a number of different places that are quite protracted crises. So Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic. I mean, these are countries where we have worked for decades, and I think it's very likely we will continue to work for decades. And so there, the way of working is not necessarily an emergency response capability or mode. These are still humanitarian emergencies. There are population displacements. We ensure that the projects are capable of pivoting and scaling up and implementing something like a mass casualty plan or something. But these are protracted ongoing crises where we need to maintain a presence, and can invest in providing high quality medical care or water and sanitation services or something. But it is, I think we need to sort of make a distinction between the sudden onset crises like the Syria, Turkey earthquakes, or even the initial phases of a new conflict, and because there's a way of working that is still similar. And what I mean by that is that we're a principled organization that has built our way of working around humanitarian principles of independence, impartiality, and neutrality. So we assert those, and that's how we build acceptance and manage risk at field level in very at times volatile kinds of circumstances. So it's about negotiating. It's about establishing a presence that's fundamentally about delivering medical care, but it certainly can be under extremely difficult and quite volatile sorts of circumstances.
And I wanted to ask about that, not just that, but one of the things. So, like when I think of the work that MSF does, I think of field hospitals or clinics or vaccine efforts, or as you've mentioned,
Yep.
sanitation and clean water programs to hopefully take care of things like cholera, get it under control,
Yep.
or go into an area where there's been an earthquake, the sewers have been destroyed. You guys have the skills and the knowledge to set up temporary sanitation facilities so that people are not contaminating what's left of the local water supply, for instance. But doing that kind of work, and you and I have talked about this before, and I remember being quite pleased with myself. I was all chuffed because you had said you'd almost never been asked this before, but I had asked you what kind of like logistical train you guys need to move with you. So if you're going into a conflict zone, or if you're going to an area that's just been flattened by a massive earthquake, and the telephone lines have been destroyed, the cell towers have been destroyed, and the local radio station is buried under 200 tons of rubble. How do you guys communicate? How do you provide security for your own facilities? Do you have security detachments, or do you rely on local military forces? How do you bring your own power? How do you eat yourselves? Like, what kind of logistics ability do you need to have to basically put a field hospital into a war zone or an area where there's been, again, like an earthquake and every rail and road has been destroyed for 200 miles? How do you do that?
It's a big question, Matt.
Well, I like to go for the big questions.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with the security question, because there's a few important things in there. So we have a very strict no weapons policy in all of our premises, all of our vehicles, all of our programs. We do not have armed guards. We insist on anybody entering the hospital, that they can't have a weapon. The hospital is a hospital. And we go to great lengths to ensure that it is viewed as a hospital and functions as a hospital for that purpose only. And so that's sort of a very practical thing, but that fits within a broader framework of risk management. And our ability to work in these complex places, and as I say, places that can be quite volatile, is premised on a clear understanding of what it is that we do and what we don't do. We are not a political actor. We are not a peace building organization. We are a medical humanitarian organization that provides medical care to anybody who needs it. We run hospitals, we run clinics, we do mobile clinics, and so on. And our safety is based on negotiation with all parties to the conflict and with the communities that we work with, and ensuring that there is that understanding and an acceptance of our presence. I don't want to imply by any stretch that that's a perfect, flawless kind of setup. It's not. We, talk about the security incidents that we experience. They do happen, but our risk, our approach to risk is not risk tolerance, it's risk management. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. Now, there is, of course, a certain degree of risk acceptance because, obviously working in an armed conflict entails a certain degree of risk that's higher than walking down Bank Street in Ottawa. But risk is managed as a part of our programming. So it's managed at the program level. So it's not managed at distance. It's managed by the people who are delivering the programs with the intent of how can we manage risk so that we can deliver life-saving medical care. And that comes back to the fundamental spirit of humanitarianism, of why I think all of us are doing this work and working in difficult circumstances, is because I think most of us feel, as I say, like personally and morally offended at the idea that somebody is being deprived or denied access to the very basics. So that's, there's a lot that we can unpack there in terms of our approach, but that's a very practical application of international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles, and what we believe and what we know humanitarian organizations need to do in negotiating their access and the acceptance of their presence. And so it can be it's a very difficult or different, approach than certainly like a military or a private company or something, right? Because the bottom line for us is about delivering services and providing access. So,
I've talked to the disaster assistance relief team operated by the Canadian Armed Forces, and they don't go anywhere without an infantry detachment to provide security for their field operations. And that's just baked right into their plan. They also do crowd management and things like that, because they're often kind of, as you guys, going to very different areas.
Yep.
I want to move on to the specific issue of Asia, but just one quick follow-up question of that. What about just the more basics, like your own food, communications, like sat phones or ham radios? Like, how do you guys drop into an area where there's no functioning infrastructure left and call for help?
Yeah. Ham radios. I have a ham radio license because I've been around long enough, I guess. But we have our own logistics hub. So as I say, doing 16 million outpatient consultations. We do mostly our own procurement. So we have our own independent supply chains. We procure everything from medicines to vehicles to IV fluids and food and that sort of thing. So that's one of the initial sort of assessments and in fact, this can actually be a very useful role for us to play, is particularly in like previously functioning health systems, like in a middle income country, for example, like in Ukraine. The more useful or most useful sort of role for us to play in some instances, maybe in providing access to an emergency logistics supply chain.
Replace what has been destroyed or lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the intent is for us to be able to establish our own logistics and to not be dependent on some other structure, because again that factors into our risk assessments and so on. Yeah, so we have supply hubs that are set up around the world. So we have warehouses in, a couple in Europe, a couple in the Middle East, one in East Africa, and so that it does a few things. One is that it allows us to maintain and manage our own independent supply chain, so we know where things are. But we've also moved to a lot of like compartmentalization or packaging of different things. So like, pre-positioned trauma kits or emergency obstetric kits or something, right? We know what you need to have in a kit to set up a cholera treatment center or to provide primary healthcare or something. So, you can package that up and we know how many consultations and things we can provide with that. So it's about
And then you also know where they are because you operate your own warehouses.
Yeah. I mean, I think we learned a lesson, just like everybody else did during the pandemic, that we're operating within a globalized supply chain and marketplace, and so that can be challenging. But yeah.
One last follow up on this, and it's just a brief one. Then we'll move on to what you had originally flagged for me. Actually, your personnel, when you're dropping a team into an area, are these full-time MSF employees who might have idle periods, or are these volunteers who leave their job at some other facility? Like, so we're talking about supplies, logistics hubs, transportation, fuel, food.
Yeah.
Where do your human beings come from?
Yeah, so more than 80% of our staff are locally hired staff. So I mean, that's one of the big things that I'm not sure people are also aware of, is that the vast majority of the medical care that we provide is provided by local physicians, nurses, drivers, that sort of thing. So in 2022, we had a staff complement of somewhere around 47 or 48,000 people. And so, as I say, more than 80% of those people are local staff. Many, we have a lot of physicians and nurses and other health professionals and administrators and logisticians and so on that work for us for many, many years. And it's about 8 to 10% of our staff complement is what we call internationally mobile staff. And so those are people who, can be on a fixed contract. So like our emergency teams, we have people that are on fixed contracts where their job is, as I say, to jump when something
to be on
happens.
Standby, ready to go. Yeah.
So those are very experienced field people that, are able to come in and get programs up and running and so on. But, we send a couple hundred Canadians to our projects every year. And some of those are people that work pretty close to full time for us. And others, we'll do an assignment. And typically we send people to a project for 6, 8, 12 months, sometimes longer. So we do have a lot of people that are nurses, physicians, physiotherapists, pharmacists, whatever, and have a career here in Canada, and then detach for a fixed period of time for us and kind of rotate in and out.
So you and I have been gabbing for a while, and I it's funny. Speaking with Jason Nickerson right now from MSF, and the reason he and I are having this conversation is because a couple of weeks ago he had flagged for me something in particular he wanted to talk about, and I had actually said, we're in the middle of launching a new podcast, just come on the damn thing. And I begged his indulgence for a couple of weeks while we got our own back end organized here. Everything you and I have talked about for now, Jason, and I thank the patient viewers and listeners. This has all been preamble because I wanted everyone to come into it understanding you, the job you do, the job MSF does, like all of these things. Tell me about the specific issue that you actually had brought to my attention a couple of weeks ago, because you and I have already mentioned Ukraine, Gaza, Africa. It's Asia that you actually had recently returned from here. The world is full of humanitarian problems, but the problem of the Rohingya is an especially interesting one from the Canadian perspective, because Canada had taken sort of a prominent diplomatic role, largely in the person of Bob Ray,
Yep.
who was appointed like a special emissary to oversee this, which gave Canada unusual insight into what's been happening there. So you have stressed to me, and I respect this, that your job is not political. In the safest way possible, can you kind of describe for me the broader humanitarian context of this problem, and then we'll get into the details you want to talk about.
Yeah, sure. So I was just in Bangladesh. So the context here is that in 2017, in North Rakhine State, which is in Myanmar, it's a state that borders on to Bangladesh. Um, there was a campaign of very systematic violence perpetrated towards the Rohingya people. So the Rohingya people are a stateless people who have lived in Myanmar for a very long time, and have been subject to varying levels of extreme violence at different moments in time. In 2017, as I say, there was this campaign of violence that really became extreme in August of 2017. And that led to hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from Myanmar into Bangladesh. There was already a refugee camp that was there in a place called Cox's Bazar. And ultimately, this camp today has grown to be the largest refugee camp in the world. There's about 1 million people who are there. And it is essentially a fenced camp where people are stranded in many ways. And the conditions are really quite abhorrent, to be very honest with you. We're now approaching 7 years of this emergency, and there's no clear solution in sight for where these people are going to go. They remain stateless, so that means that they lack basic citizenships, visas, or passports rather. And the situation in Myanmar at the moment is quite volatile. An MSF office was burned down the other day, for example. So yeah, we are actually the largest provider of medical care in the camps. And I'll just say a few things. One is that Bangladesh provided asylum to people in 2017 by opening the borders and allowing people to cross, and that is a good thing. But the reality of today is that the interest from the international community has waned. That means that funding has also started to decrease. The availability of services has decreased, and the conditions in the camp are bad. From a public health perspective, we've seen outbreaks of infectious diseases. We have been responding to a large scabies outbreak that is almost unheard of in terms of its scope and its scale. And that's a direct indicator of the poor public health and sanitation conditions in the camp. So this can't continue, but I think everybody, including us, is struggling with, like, where do 1 million people go to live a life of freedom, dignity, safety, and so on. And so yeah, we will continue to work there, and as MSF, since this crisis happened, we've committed close to $250 million in programming to responding to the Rohingya crisis. But we're now also working in places like Malaysia because people are fleeing or being trafficked out of the camp, trying to reach somewhere with relative more safety and stability, but find themselves in Malaysia living quite precariously and at risk of being arrested and detained in immigration detention and so on. And so we're viewing this now as a very regional kind of crisis. But it unfortunately is falling off the radars of many people, including here in Canada.
one of the reasons I was eager to talk with you about this, even though it sucks, like this is awful, some of the stuff we're talking about, is I had covered the 2017 genocide.
Interesting. Yeah.
I wasn't on the ground. I was absorbing what I could from afar. We had in the West in particular, Jason. Now you obviously have a different world view into this because you've been in some of these conflict zones. The last couple of years, Westerners who have generally known peace, security, tranquility, stability,
Mm.
we have seen not just conflicts. We've the newspapers and the radio shows and the TV programs have always been like, today in an outlying village somewhere in a country you've never heard of, security forces arrived and massacred the locals. But with Ukraine, and then I would say particularly October 7th, and then the fighting since then, we in the West have seen in literal high definition what some of this stuff looks like. And I'd written a column before about how it's one thing to read about, oh, the pogrom or the sectarian violence. It's
Yeah.
another thing to watch it on someone's GoPro feed when they have either been a witness or even a perpetrator of the violence. And I think this has shocked the conscience of a lot of Westerners. I don't know if it's going to rally them to action, but I think it's one thing to have an intellectual understanding of what a sectarian battle looks like, and it's another thing to watch it.
Yeah.
And what happened to the Rohingya in 2017 was some of the worst stuff I've read about, and I've read about a lot of bad stuff. We're talking about massacre, mass rape, the destruction of entire settlements, burning them to the ground, indiscriminate and targeted killing of entire civilian populations when possible. This is the stuff we read in our history books, and we're glad we don't have to deal with it anymore. And then it was happening. I understand why a million of these people fled for their lives. Now they're stuck there. What are you've told me that the conditions in the camp are bad, but can you describe a little bit what it is like in the camp? Like if you were to visit there, what would you see?
So first of all, it's massive. It's sprawling, but it's very dense. Um, and it has this strange sense of permanence and impermanence at the same time. People are living in bamboo shelters. It just, I've been in a number of different camps around the world, and this is just, it's different. Um, and we're talking about 1 million people living in something like 33 square kilometers. Like, this is not a big area. It's very densely populated. But people also lack the legal right to leave and to work and gain a meaningful employment and generate economic activity and so on. And so there's a lot of people, and including kids, who are just around, and it's a very I mean, people told me that they felt hopeless, is the word that was used in several of the conversations that I had. And we're talking to people who are educated, who want to be doing something for themselves. They want a future, right? And they're at the same time telling us and telling me that they're stuck there, and it's difficult to imagine a future. And when I asked people what it is that they want, so many people just say that they want to go back home, right? And we hear this all around the world all the time. People want to go home. They want to have a life of meaning. They want freedoms. They want rights. And that is something that I heard very, very consistently when I was there earlier this year. But it's also, it continues to be an emergency in the sense that there is just a lack of very essential services. I mean, we are providing hospital-based care as best we can. I mean, we have a number of clinics and inpatient beds and so on. But there's 1 million people there, right? And we're running a handful of hospitals and clinics. We're talking about a population that's roughly the size of Ottawa.
Ottawa, yeah, Ottawa or Edmonton, yeah.
Yeah. And there are multiple tertiary care hospitals here with hundreds of beds each. That's simply not the case. I mean, there are medical needs that are simply not capable of being met with the resources that are there. Now, the other big issue that has come to the forefront recently is food. And unfortunately, this is a global phenomenon as well, where, you know, the World Food Program is generally the provider of food assistance in humanitarian emergencies. But we are seeing in multiple parts of the world that they are simply stretched. So the food rations that are provided, and is provided in a cash form in the Rohingya camp, is $10 per person per month. Is the food assistance that people are provided. It's not possible to meet somebody's caloric requirements and nutritional requirements on $10 per month. Simply not possible. And that's, you know, a reality that we are seeing not only in Bangladesh, but in other places as well, where, you know, the resources that are available to respond to needs simply aren't there.
You know, you mentioned scabies a few minutes ago. Yep. And I'm not a medical expert. You have a better background in that's the stuff than I do, but I know my history well enough to know that that is medieval, and that is what happens when you have populations that lack, as you say, baseline daily calories, which allow them to have robust immune systems. Yep. And you also have contaminated water. Yep. And we've talked about cholera already, diphtheria, like all these old things that North Americans have probably read about from those old pioneer days when the well got contaminated.
Yep.
You guys are dealing with it a couple of connecting plane flights away.
Yeah. Yeah. So my colleague, Adam Houston, and I wrote an op-ed just last week about this. You know, measles is an unwelcome return visitor to Canada. And
devastating in the Rohingya camp.
Yeah, and so the point that we're making here is that, like, look, we've seen more measles cases in the first quarter of 2024 than we did in Canada in all of 2023. So, you know, I think we've probably all at this point heard the warnings of, you know, it appears to be community transmission of measles in some parts of the country. But if we go back to February, March, when the chief public health officer issued a warning. The warning was to travelers, right? Make sure that if you're leaving Canada, that your vaccinations are up to date. And, you know, what we wanted to really do is to dig in a little bit to that, because measles is an infectious disease that we respond to every single day. And I mentioned this at the start of our conversation. There are huge measles outbreaks that are happening around the world right now. Like, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of cases in some instances. And there's a very significant gap in vaccination that was created during the COVID pandemic. I mean, tens of millions of children missed at least one vaccine dose. And so, like, I know that we've said this a lot during the pandemic, but like, viruses don't respect borders. Mm-hmm. You know, the incubation period between somebody being exposed to measles and actually developing, you know, the rash or the prodromal symptoms is several days. And so, you know, if we're concerned about global public health, then we have to get serious about closing some of these gaps in vaccination. But to bring it back to the Rohingya camp as well, you know, in the early phases of this emergency, one of the disease outbreaks that we saw was diphtheria, which, you know, at one point was a major source of death here in Canada. And, yeah, you know, in fact, the Connaught Labs, which was the public laboratory or drug manufacturer here, was established to produce diphtheria antitoxin.
Yeah.
And you know, vaccination efforts around the world have been so successful against diphtheria that there's a market failure for diphtheria antitoxin. And so every time there's an outbreak, and there was an outbreak in the Cox's Bazar camps, you know, we really struggled to get access to effective treatment. And again, today, it's actually the largest outbreak of diphtheria on record in history is happening right now in West Africa. And, you know, we are really struggling to get access to, I mean, one, vaccines need to be scaled up and produced. So there's a challenge there, but there's an extreme difficulty in getting access to diphtheria antitoxin as a treatment for the disease. So that's a bit of a slight diversion from what we were talking about in terms of the Rohingya camps. But the underlying issue is that, like, yeah, when you have people in any kind of congregate setting or an overcrowded setting, particularly a population that is stressed, the reality is that there are public health needs that are going to emerge, and that the system, is really struggling to meet those needs, particularly in this camp setting.
You are a non-political actor.
Yeah.
You are apolitical in that sense, and you have to be, and I respect that. But I want to say this to you, and I want to get your response to it. I don't mean to lead you in any awkward places. You and I have had many conversations over the years about a lot of different humanitarian crises, and
Yeah.
you and I aren't close friends, but we've talked. We've talked on the record, off the record.
Yeah.
You seemed, from my perspective, more upset after your visit to the Rohingya camp than I had seen you thus far. And I'm not here to give you impromptu therapy, but I'm just saying you're a guy who's seen some shit. And you came back from the Rohingya camp upset and
Yeah.
frustrated. And
Yeah.
one of the things you had spoken about, and again, not saying this in a partisan way, but you talked about failures in foreign aid policy.
Yeah.
And one of the things you had mentioned a minute ago, and I think we're all grown-ups here. We've all made a few trips around the sun. We know that when you have, we talked about this already, when you have a doubling in the baseline need for humanitarian support all over the world, the older crises tend to fall off the radar. And
Yeah.
Ukraine, and I would say Gaza right now, are getting a lot of the attention. And that means longer running crises like in Africa, which, and a series of them have flared up in the last 6 months, combined with the Rohingya, which we've been dealing with now for 7 years.
Yep.
These things lack political novelty.
Yep.
And they just fall off the radar here. How do you and your colleagues try to combat that? And I'm not making any partisan accusations here. I don't think this matters what party is in power. I think it's just a human nature thing. The more novel crisis grabs the attention.
Yeah, and I know you're not saying this, but I'm just going to say it to be clear.
Please.
Like, that doesn't take away from the reality of humanitarian needs existing in places like Ukraine and Gaza and others. I mean, people are suffering, and there needs to be an effective humanitarian response there. And neither of us is saying something different, but I just want to make that point. And yeah, it's really quite disheartening in many ways, but I also understand that we all have a limited ability to absorb information.
Bad news.
And bad news. And that's where I think we feel a real deep moral responsibility to continue to talk about these crises. And we have this debate internally all the time. How do we bring more attention to what's happening in a place like Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where conflict has flared, for the last 2 years, and there are millions of people who are displaced. There are incredible levels of sexual violence, of physical violence, and massive humanitarian needs. And there's very little media attention to this, and it's by and large off people's radar. I mean, we as an organization, and I certainly as an individual, feel a real responsibility to talk to politicians, talk to the Canadian public, like talk to people who need to know this and who are hopefully in a position to take some action on it. Because just coming back to what you had said, we're not a political actor at all. Doctors can't stop bombs. We say this all the time. We are not the ones who can address the underlying political crises that are driving so many of these crises in the world. And that's where states and governments and other political actors have a responsibility. And one of the ways in which we remind them of that responsibility is by continuing to talk about the humanitarian needs and the humanitarian realities in places like Gaza, certainly, but also in Cox's Bazar, in DRC, in Sudan, and others. But it's challenging. There's no question about that. It's like the work itself is challenging, and getting traction and attention is challenging. But it's also personally challenging, right? I mean, these are difficult issues to wrestle with and to work on every day. And I think people that work for our organization and others as well, humanitarians, know this and feel compelled to do the work anyhow.
For what it's worth, and I offer this, I guess, as a kind of confession. One of the reasons I was really motivated and happy, if that's the word, to talk with you about this is because in 2017, when the Rohingya were attacked, and when they were slaughtered and raped and driven out of their homes, and then their homes were burned to the ground, their villages were destroyed. I remember the satellite imagery. I'm sure you will too, where the government forces in Myanmar were denying anything was happening, and with every satellite pass, there were entire settlements that just were gone.
Yeah.
And I was engaged with that. I read about that. I spoke with Bob Ray. I was engaged with that. And then you mentioned to me a few weeks ago that you were just back from the Rohingya camps, and I went, "Oh yeah, the Rohingya."
Yep.
It had just been pushed off my radar by the succession of crises we've had from 2017 to now. And something very similar happened. I was covering the Haiti earthquake and the U.S. Canadian military intervention after that, because Haiti no longer had a functional government, and basically we temporarily occupied the country, and then we left, and then it collapsed again, and then humanitarian forces and peacekeeping forces went back, and then they left. I'd forgotten about Haiti. I was reading in preparatory work for this interview. I was reading about some of the humanitarian flashpoints. I forgot about Boko Haram. I forgot about Bring Back Our Girls. Like, we've just been punched in the face by reality so many times in recent years that I forgot. And talking about the Rohingya, like this refugee camp in Bangladesh you've been telling me about, if you run into a 5 or a 6-year-old kid there, they've known nothing else.
Yes.
Their world is 33 square kilometers, scabies, and $10 a month worth of food. That's their existence. And that I guess, like, I'm forced to divide my outrage among like 15 different topics a day. You can linger, you can focus a bit more, but that pisses me off.
Yeah.
And we're getting a little tight on time here, and I've burned so much of your time. You had wanted to make just a comment on the budget that was released this week, because there has been some investments in foreign aid here. And again, I'm not asking this politically, but I'm just talking about when a country like Canada says it is going to up its foreign aid budget, how does an organization like you respond to that?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're not asking politically, and I'm not answering politically.
Far from it.
Perish
the thoughts, sir. Perish the thought.
As I say, like, we're an organization that's by and large privately funded. So we have quite limited public institutional funding, though Canada, as I say, is one of our donors. But we're reacting positively to this. Like, the budget is committing, I believe it's $350 million over 2 years to respond to humanitarian emergencies. I think we need to put that in context of a reality that many countries are going the other way, and cutting aid budgets. And so this is a good thing. We have been pushing both publicly and through private dialogue and so on. As I say, part of our role is to draw attention to neglected humanitarian crises that need, in some cases it's funding. In many cases, there's huge funding gaps. So, this can and should be an important contribution. What I would say, though, is that the world doesn't only need to close a funding gap. It's also about countries playing a leadership role in responding to these crises, not only as a donor, but also, in finding political solutions to these crises, as I mentioned. And, we've talked a lot about Bob Ray and the work that he did as the special envoy in 2017. And I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that Canada played a significant leadership role in responding to the Rohingya crisis through, Ambassador Ray's report. So he released a report with 19 different recommendations in 2018. But then Canada in the federal budget committed twice to fund a Rohingya strategy that was quite specific in saying Canada should play a leadership role in responding to this financially, sure, but also in finding long-term and meaningful solutions. And unfortunately, that strategy, to our knowledge, had expired in the previous fiscal year. It wasn't in Tuesday's budget, a renewal. And I don't know what that means, but it would be a real disservice to the Rohingya people for Canada to walk away from its responsibilities here. And I fully acknowledge that just because it's not in the budget doesn't mean that Canada's not going to do it. But I think that the fact that it was in the budget provided high-level buy-in from the Canadian government to respond to this crisis. And I think that was significant and was important, because when you're in Bangladesh and when you're in the region, people talk about the reality that Canada has been working to create humanitarian space so that organizations like ours can do the work that we do, and has been a powerful advocate and has been active in trying to find meaningful long-term solutions for the Rohingya people, and they absolutely should continue doing that.
I've got one final question for you, and I've left it to the last, but it's an easy one. And I'm going to make sure when I when this is edited in the text version of it here, I'm totally breaking the fourth wall, but like when this goes out, the body text of it will have this much further up than the end of the conversation, and it'll be mentioned in my introductory remarks as well. You've mentioned you're a privately funded organization. For anyone who has been listening to us today and it has been moved by your words, where should they go to find out more, and where should they go to help?
So they can go to our website. It's doctorswithoutborders.ca or msf.ca. We're extremely grateful for the financial support that Canadians provide to us. It allows us to be able to work in very difficult places and to react and respond quickly when crises happen.
Well, for what it's worth, and partially out of guilt and partially out of a sense of being pissed off, I'm going to go up my donation today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for not only for the hour plus of your time today, but for the work you and your colleagues are doing here. If you don't mind, I'd like to check in with you in a few months, kind of get an update on the Rohingya situation, but also whatever fresh hell happens next. So
yeah, always happy to chat.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for doing this.
That was Jason Nickerson from MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, talking about his experiences, his career, the work his organization does, and ways that you can help. The next episode of the Line podcast will be recorded shortly, live and in person in Calgary. We hope you enjoy that. Give us a couple of days to get that turned around to you. So stay tuned. It's coming. And in the meantime, like, subscribe, follow us on YouTube and the streaming app of your choice. Check us out at readtheline.ca. And if you have a few extra bucks, well, obviously we hope you subscribe to us, but also MSF is doing great work all over the world. Check out their websites. Help them out if you can. Thank you for the time, as always. This is Matt Gurney from The Line, and this has been the latest episode of On the Line.